Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Some of you may be familiar with today's guests, Timothy and David Gordon. They're the authors of a new book from TAN called Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left. And it is, as it sounds, it's basically a book to try to get conservatives to smarten up, stop being so timid, stop being so atactical, and stop having their butts handed to them at every turn by the radical left, which entails to a certain extent studying the tactics of the left and learning to make use of those which can be used morally by good Christians. One of the reasons I started following their work in the first place is because they have an upcoming book called No Christian Feminism, which will be published by Sophia later this year. And as you guys know, I'm very anti-feminist, and I agree with the Gordon brothers that all the stages of feminism have been bad from the first wave on. However, I know from following their discussions of the topic that there are some aspects of their approach to it that I disagree with. And I would say specifically not their opposition to feminism per se, or indeed their support of what can only be fairly called patriarchy. And I don't think that's a word that we should be ashamed of, as Carrie Gress pointed out in a recent article for The Catholic Thing. But specifically in their interpretation of certain church teachings and traditions on the precise details, I guess, of the roles of the sexes in society, and perhaps also maybe with some of the details of the, I don't know what you'd call it, the ontology or the anthropology of the sexes. Just as an example, I take issue with some things that Tim has said about Pope St. John Paul II's concept of mutual submission between the spouses. Actually, from what I understand to be their positions on that, I think I am more in agreement with Dave on that than with Tim. So in a sense, this interview, although I certainly think their present book, Rules for Retrogrades, is worth talking about in its own right, this conversation was really meant, in a sense, as a prelude to establish some common ground and to make for a more friendly and fruitful discussion and perhaps at least partially debate later on in whatever form that may end up taking, whether it's a book review, another podcast interview, or something like that when their book, No Christian Feminism, comes out. All of that is kind of to say that this episode for me was not the place for a debate of the finer points of the roles of men and women. There's probably a couple little points in this episode that I let pass by without contesting them or sort of like raising them as an issue. But the fact is that I'm still in the midst of studying a lot of these issues and with renewed interest and vigor in preparation for the release of their book, not only for a discussion with them, but simply to be prepared for what I think will be quite a surge of interest in this topic when that book comes out. I mean, I think it's going to have an impact one way or the other. So you can definitely expect to see me trying to hash some of these issues out in the future. Just one other quick note before I run the interview. As I was listening back to it, I found myself dissatisfied with what was said when the topic of prayer came up. There was a point that I wish I had made or pressed a little harder. So I have put some further comments on that topic at the end of this episode after the interview. So if you listen all the way to the end, you'll hear those. Tim and David Gordon, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Hi, thanks, Thomas, for having us on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great to meet you by Sound Power.
So this is kind of exciting for me because, first of all, I really liked your new book, Rules for Retrogrades. But secondly, there's another aspect to it, which is that I think you guys and I come from, this is not a great word, but slightly different camps, maybe, within the Catholic world. I don't know if you would describe yourselves as traditionalists per se, but you are within those circles, I suppose, more than I am. That's probably fair to say. There are things that I'm aware of that I disagree with you guys on. So it feels also like the beginning of a dialogue. And I like the fact that you guys have been doing that with people like Matt Fradd, for example. I think it's a very healthy thing for the church when there's potential for internal division to do that. So I'm thankful for you guys coming on the show for that reason as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
that's really gracious of you. We appreciate it. And yeah, absolutely. It's really important to avoid factiousness in the church, to really present a united front while at the same time, celebrating some of the differences between devotions. Some Catholics have particularly strong devotions to one saint or another. Some have a stronger devotion to some element of liturgy or another. But the important thing is that we're all in communion with each other under the headship of the Roman pontiff.
Absolutely.
Just to go back to what you said before, yeah, it's a lot easier to get along with guys like you and Matt Fradd than a lot of guys that are closer to our orbit, known as the trads. A lot of those guys are just quick to be pugnacious and to pick a nit, even if it's microscopic compared to the great constellation of things. So we're always happy to come and talk to jolly guys that are looking to build bridges, or legitimate bridges.
You guys have two books coming out. Well, one of them has just been released, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left. I think it's good to start here with maybe laying out the worldview that you're describing or that you're addressing this book to. Have you guys ever heard of a guy named Michael Malice?
I have not.
Okay, well, without getting into who he is, he's not somebody that we would agree with on many things, but he occasionally has kind of an apt perception of the political boundaries in our society. And he's made a couple of remarks that I'd just like to sort of throw out there and see how you respond and if it resonates with what you're talking about in this book. So the first thing he says is that, and these are somewhat provocative, they may not be literally true, but the first thing is you can find out if somebody is left-wing versus right-wing if you ask them, are all people equal? And if they do anything except say no without hemming and hawing, they're left-wing. And the second thing is a conservative is a progressive driving the speed limit. So where do those two statements sort of fit in with your idea of what it means to be a retrograde?
Tim, why don't you take this one, since the Rules for Retrogrades book was actually Tim's brainchild. It's something we've been cooking up ideas for how to retake the culture for since I was in early college and Tim was in graduate school. But the book itself was really Tim's brainchild. So I think it's appropriate that maybe he kicks us off here.
Yeah, well, I also wrote the rule on, we did 20 and 20 out of those 40 tactics, how to defeat the radical left. I did the one on egalitarianism, so I guess it's apropos of the rule for me to answer it. It's absolutely true. Egalitarianism is sort of the watchword of modernism. And it's actually, it's beating heart more than it's the watchword. Egalitarianism is at the center of the leftism, which eventuated with the French Revolution and started being cooked up really about 2 centuries before that with the Protestant Reformation. It's there in the drafting of the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita, which is almost exactly a century before the Freemasons reformed in 1717. All this goes to say, yeah, egalitarianism equals leftism. So I'm happy to hear that there's a brother from another mother out there that I might not agree with about everything. Michael Malice. I have heard his name more recently.
He's kind of a Randian libertarian type.
Yeah, well, he's dead on. I mean, the heart of all 3 of the acceptable forms of regime for an Aristotomist, for a Catholic who knows what's up, is a rejection of egalitarianism. So, I mean, the natural aristoi, the best in society, will be accorded their due. The noble will be accorded their due on any of the 3 proper regimes, whether it's a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a republic. And the 3 perversions of those will all egalitarianize, for lack of a better term. So Michael Malice is right on.
What does it mean to be, you said somebody who rejects egalitarianism. Is there anything more than that to being a retrograde? Is there like a particular cultural or religious connotation to it?
Tim, this one's you still. This is your rule. So yeah, I defer on this.
Man, all the ones people want to talk about. No, I'm just kidding. People are going to have to get used to our brotherly jibes in these things. I think Dave, I don't want to keep deferring back and forth, but you said it well the other night with Coffin. No, it's not just about egalitarianism. It's really about a kind of fustiness, right? A kind of willingness to join the fray, into the breach. Once again, dear friends, that kind of thing. So I think it's Christians. There is an essentially Christian character to conservatism and an essentially Catholic character to intellectual conservatism. And a retrograde is, of course, an intellectual that likes to fight, not just with words, but is willing to back it up. There's a Doc Holliday character to being a retrograde. In some ways, he might, you can argue you can fight it out with weapons or you can fight it out in Latin. So, I mean, I think that's kind of it. It's the fustiness.
So it's not just your worldview, but it's also a lack of timidity or kind of a willingness to say what is considered impolite for the sake of truth.
Right, Dave?
Yeah,
I mean,
we have a rule about that
Christians
too.
Are cowards for the most part. We don't like that.
That's
Sorry,
true.
Dave.
Yeah, and we speak to this, one of the most important rules and one of the most, I would say, fundamental rules that kind of drives the rest of the rules because it's the substance. A lot of the rules are based on procedure. How do we go about taking back the culture? But there's the whole question of what are we installing when we depose the evil, secularized, rationalized culture? And that's the substance. And so one of our rules, which I see as fundamental, is never be afraid to speak the truth. You have to go say what is true and correct, even though the embedded progressives in society, the powers that be, are going to try and scold you and get you fired from your job and give you all sorts of temporal consequences to make you join their side, or at least to make you scared to speak up on behalf of the ideas, the ideology, the worldview of your side. And so one of the main things is this is conservatism, theological and political with teeth. It's the opposite of the feckless, spineless conservatism that we've grown accustomed to in 20th and 21st century Western countries, where the good guys, whether it's the political conservatives or the church conservatives, are always getting whooped and kind of led around and bullied by the bad guys. We don't want that to happen anymore, because what happens as an eventuality when you have the good guys' agenda being dictated to them by the evil guys, ultimately we lose the culture and evil prevails, and we need to reverse this paradigm. So that means with regard to Republicans, everybody is sick of them getting told what to do by Democrats, by having Democrats set their agenda. And it's certainly true with conservatives in the church being afraid to speak up or, getting relegated to the head of the Order of Malta or whatnot.
Right. One of the things that I've been thinking about for some time, and this goes to your point about speaking the truth, and particularly rule number 3, I don't know who wrote that, no truth is off limits. So which of you wrote that one?
That's mine, and that's what I'm referencing with my prior answer. Yeah.
Nice job there. Yeah, there's an aspect of that I've been considering for some time, because I've kind of tried to make it my way of being for a couple of years, which is that you should never fear the consequences of the truth. I think a lot of people even not only censor their words, but they censor their thought process because they're afraid that admitting a certain truth to them will lead them to become something they don't want to be.
Right.
Or they'll censor themselves because, well, I could never say this, so therefore I can't even think it. My attitude, there's a line from Jordan Peterson, poor guy, which I like, where he says, tell the truth, and if you can't tell the truth, at least don't lie, which is it's a really good point. You can at least start out by being, even if you don't have the courage yet to speak, you can at least start out by being courageous in your thoughts and not running away from the truth, even inside your own mind, because that's the ultimate goal, right? Is to not just get people to be silent, but to get people to deny the truth, even in their hearts. So I've always tried to be fearless, even if I'm not fearless socially, fearless in my own mind in pursuing the truth and trusting that truth is the same as love. So no matter how it may sound, if I say it to someone else, I know that if I admit the truth, it's not going to lead me to something evil or something mean or malicious.
Sure. And weaklings are obsessed with optics. There are some truths that are so-called leaders, whether it's political or even religious, they just won't speak up for because they've been told that these are inherently hateful truths. To acknowledge certain facts of life, certain truths about the way the universe is, about how God structured creation, and especially that's true with, one might say, pre-existing categories like sex or something like that. The fact that there is a natural hierarchy of the sexes, as there is with the angels, with men sitting atop this natural hierarchy. And that's just Aquinas and Augustine. But people think that you cannot say that because it's going to be inherently offensive or inherently evil somehow to just acknowledge something that's so countercultural, because we live in an age of hyper-egalitarianism where everything has to be just flattened out. There can be no hierarchies in anything. So we've been taught, we've had it drilled into our heads that saying certain things is just anathema. And if you say them, you become a bad person. And the left specializes in this. They specialize in making us feel as if we are some kind of a sociopath for just acknowledging truths that might be unpleasant to ears conditioned by the hyper-egalitarianism of the West. So everything, have you noticed, is phobic, right?
Right.
If you're against something, there's something, it's not just that you're against something based on this intellectual understanding that you have of it. It's that there's something wrong with you. You know, if you are against homosexuality, you see it as a vile, depraved act, then you're homophobic. If you don't want to goose step along with the ridiculous notion that a man can become a woman simply by virtue of being confused about his sexual identity and throwing on some cheap lipstick, then you are transphobic. About women, if you believe that a woman has her place in the home and is subordinate to her husband, then you're gynophobic. And it goes on and on and on. If you don't want unfettered immigration so that our country is ripped apart and loses its culture, then you are xenophobic. So there's a phobia for each thing that's a progressive cause. If you don't embrace the progressive cause, then you're somehow phobic instead of just someone who sees through their cheap tricks and smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, and even a lot of conservatives who will admit some of these things. Well, let's take the hierarchy, in marriage, for example. They'll say, well, yes, that's true, but, I don't want to say it because I don't want to give justification or give aid and comfort to abusers. But that's just not, you just got to live your life and say what's true, say it in the most helpful way you can, but make it clear that it doesn't condone abuse or treating, as Pius XI said in Casti Connubii, treating the wife like she's a minor. Or as Augustine says, the abuse of a thing doesn't take away its proper use. So we shouldn't refrain from speaking the truth for that reason either.
That's why the old-fashioned term, I mean, man, this is what's beautiful about tradition with a lowercase t, and I'm not talking about Catholicism. I just mean go watch a bunch of Westerns, look at French romantic novels about guys having duels. They got a word for everything. And the word, we're trying to overthink it and build these longer and longer compound nouns like the Germans did. There's a word for that. It's a coward. And somebody that won't say what the truth is, even though they secretly think it, they're a coward. And that's most Christians. That's most conservatives. And that's the problem. Look, the problem ain't the left. They're the enemy, but they're not the problem. The problem is cowards that are conservatives and Christians. And the problem really is that the norm is cowardly Christians and conservatives. I mean, it's just, if it's true, say it. You said, make it clear that you're not talking about the abuse of a thing. Well, that goes, but I mean, that's an infinite regression. I don't speak that way all the time. I don't say, hey, I like basketball, and that means basketball well played rather than poorly played. That's implicit.
Yeah, that's
so when
totally
I say whatever I say, I'm not even going to bother to make it clear for my listener that, when I say men are supposed to model themselves after great kings, great virtuous kings, and women are supposed to model themselves after the great virtuous queen who's Mary, I'm not going to go through a bunch of by-language or by-speak or boilerplate and say, therefore don't abuse women. That's stupid. Everyone knows what we're talking about. It's the function argument as a first principle, meaning an unspoken principle.
Right. And progressives win when they have you stumbling all over yourself,
making qualifications
to rule out every single possible objection and perversion of an idea, because then, like Tim says, your idea gets buried in a mass of boilerplate.
That's a very good point. So yeah, you want to, sometimes you just have to be able to say something without qualifications. There may be moments when it's appropriate to make a certain qualification or clarification if there's a genuine misunderstanding and not just a list of what about things thrown at you. Because as you say, that's something that they try to distract you with. to get you to address all the possible abuses and exceptions to what you've said.
Right. Right. Think about in the realm of abortion, right? Saying mothers shouldn't murder their children. These vicious women shouldn't murder their children. And then people start talking about every kind of sob story that can pop into the human imagination. It's like, look, you can't murder your kid. That's the rule. That's the simple rule. If you murder your kid, you are a sinner and a severely depraved person. This sin cries out to heaven for vengeance. If I say that it's wrong to rob a bank, I don't feel it incumbent upon myself to be like, now the bank robber, he might be in financial distress. He might have bills due.
Yeah,
so it really wasn't him
This is what
all
I
the
say.
way.
A lot of crimes
He's under
are
duress.
committed out of economic pressure, right?
Right.
Right. Of course, all of them are. And even people who abuse drugs, it's not probably because they just want to destroy their body. They probably have some psychological issues going on, perhaps deeper ones than women who choose to terminate the life of a child who is utterly dependent on them. So I almost have more compassion for somebody who's self-medicating with drugs than somebody who commits the most severe crime against nature to rob your own child of its life.
People also don't understand that you can say that stuff very frankly and still be compassionate. And that's the paradox of Christian forgiveness, right? Like you can recognize the full gravity of an evil or a sin and be compassionate and forgiving and want the person to go to heaven. But it actually does a discredit to God's love and mercy to downplay the evil, right? Because then you're not giving God's love and mercy if its full opportunity to shine forth in all its glory, right?
Right. So it's a slight, if you'll forgive my priggishness, a slight correction. It's a sine qua non. It's an without which not condition that in order for there to be mercy, there has to be full acknowledgement of the sin. In other words, there wouldn't be such a thing as mercy or compassion unless we were talking in Dostoevskian terms, right? I mean, this is what Dostoevsky gets, and they don't teach much Dostoevsky at the university anymore. That is truly fully Christian. Dostoevsky gives you the portrait of a murderer, right, of Raskolnikov or of Smerdyakov or Ivan Karamazov, and makes them fully despicable in the eyes of man. Sets it out on the shelf for all to see, and goes on page after page what their pretty wicked motivations were. All of these guys are borderline aristocrats, and so they didn't even have the borderline inculpable mens rea of poverty or whatever you want to call it. We know how wicked they were, how black their heart was when they commit the crime. And with all of that, all other things being equal, they turn it over and Christ died for them. And the one truly dignitarian faith, Christianity, it says, hey, there's a place for you too, as long as you turn it over while you still draw breath.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't take that as priggish at all. It's an essential point to make. We were talking about this abortion thing and this kind of false compassion. This is something that your rule number one, always be on offense, made me think of, because there's so many different ways where the way that they try to put us on the defensive when they should be on the defensive for defending the indefendable, right? So it's still shocking to me that I hear Catholics saying this. So, right, this started out as a talking point on the pro-abortion side. You're not pro-life, you're just pro-birth. I'm sure you've heard that a million times. Now I hear it from seamless garment types in the church, actually using this straight from the pit of hell, the pro-abortion movement talking point to score points against their fellow Catholics. You should always be able to say, no, I disagreed with paid maternity leave recently as like a government mandated policy. And somebody might say that is only pro-birth. You're not pro-life, you're pro-birth. And I'm like, no, you're pro-children staying with their mothers for a few months, right? I'm pro-mothers staying with their children for their entire childhood. So it's important to recognize where the moral balance lies and not allow yourself to be put on the defensive as though you're the one defending the morally reprobate position.
No, that's right. Rule number one was one that I wrote, actually. And it's really important. That's just the main tactic. To win a war, you have to be on offense. And if you're on defense, you are going to lose. This is just the laws of physics, actually. On a long enough time scale, anything that's possible to happen will happen. So if you are perpetually on defense, you are going to lose. And if you're perpetually on offense, you are going to win. So a trick of the left has been to weaponize each and every event that allows of weaponization. So they're using the terrain to their advantage. Whenever a current event takes place, they spin it and then they use it to drive home their message. It doesn't matter really what the current event is, because they can spin anything to become a political tool. And then they use that political cudgel to drive home what their message is. So they're always on offense. So what this means in the realm of abortion is that we, the pro-lifers, the Christians, the ones who recognize that it's evil to murder your own child, which is what abortion is. It's just thinly veiled murder. It's murder within a womb, murder within a given location. They've made us afraid to say what the truth is on the matter. And we're being castigated in a way for saying what the truth is. And they're allowed to go out with impunity and not defend themselves, the pro-abortion lobby. So we have the pro-lifers who are being scolded and made to feel ashamed. And the pro-abortion lobby is out there celebrating. They're celebrating their wicked cause, and that's what happens when you are able successfully to use the political landscape as a cudgel. That's what happens when you're always on offense.
Yeah. Think about it this way, Thomas. Conservatives and Christians are so bad at fighting. They're so bad at strategy that we just called it like a trick, that you need the ball to score. I mean, that's not a trick. That's like the worst football coach, peewee football coach in the world knows that.
Hugh Jackson even?
You have the ball, the more likely you are to win. Defenses very rarely score points, right? So conservatives are so bad at that, and Christians, we're so bad at fighting and at strategery that we think like, oh, that's a good point. You actually need to go on offense. People when they hear me debate,
right,
they say, wow, you're just always on offense. I'm like, well, because I want to win, man. I played sports. I like sports. And so a lot of this starts with these cowardly, feckless conservatives and Christians. It's kind of what conservatives and Christians are known for. It's our tagline, our byline. We're the Ned Flanderses of the world, according to the popular legendarium of both the left and the right. These guys will own it. These people just didn't play enough sports. Even the worst JV football coach in the world will tell you, well, duh, that's not a trick. That's just football 101. We need possession time of the ball. So you got to go on offense, man. Don't say you're not dumb when you debate an atheist. Say like, how do you believe in the last superstition? You're dumb. And it changes the game. People already that are reading our books, they're starting to do this and they're starting to win. That's why it's bound up with Trump. That's why Trump is a retrograde, because he actually wants to win, unlike every other conservative political candidate of my entire wretched life.
And Tim, to say it in the realm of abortion too, don't let somebody call you dumb for not believing that a mother should be able to murder her child with impunity. Call them dumb, call them wicked, call them heinous, who are actively encouraging mothers to murder their kids with impunity.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not about insulting. It's about, and this goes to another of your rules, it's about not dignifying certain things with an argument that are manifestly in bad faith or manifestly absurd. I mean, you can debate certain things, but one of your rules is Risus est bellum, laughter is war. And you make the point that certain things, the best response is laughter and ridicule, because they get you to waste time and dignify and validate absurdities like transgenderism, for example, is the example you give, rather than sort of saying, one of the things I've heard it said of the new right in general that's been coming forth the past few years is that they, unlike the old guard conservatives, are the people who are willing to say, we are not going to have this conversation. Because sometimes you just shouldn't have the conversation.
Right. True. I mean, it's all about not dignifying falsity in any way by stammering or wasting even 2 seconds with a 2-second disclaimer. But let's not be bigots here. Let's not be prejudiced. I don't want to be prejudiced against the insult, right? You can go, there are websites devoted to insults, lists of insults by Jesus and St. Paul, right? The two main sources of the Old Testament, if we're talking about the actual wisdom therein, are Jesus and St. Paul. And these guys were They were the Mac Daddies of disses and
Right, a
good,
rebuke. Yeah.
one-liners and epithets. So an epithet is not inherently wrong. So I don't want to be a bigot
No, you're right.
against epithets. They're really important in the war for truth.
St. Stephen in Acts, when he's about to be martyred, you stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart. He's dissing these people, the Pharisees, who are about to put him to death.
Right. Yeah. It's a rebuke rather than just simply something that's just said to blow off steam or out of anger or, wanting to hurt somebody. It's just being objective, essentially, and stating it in the clearest terms possible. No, you are stiff-necked. You need to hear that.
Sure. Right. Even, and I'm thinking of Peter. I believe it's St. Peter who rebukes, I don't think it's Simon Magus, but it's somebody that's dabbling in like wizardry or something to that effect. And a false prophet, he says, you servant of the devil. So yeah, why do you keep making crooked the straight paths of the Lord? So definitely holy men can give it straight. And there's been a real wussification of Christianity. Absolutely. Where we've become collectively this gaggle of pearl clutchers and virtue signalers who want to stand out from the crowd by putting their hand over the mouth, most noticeably when they see somebody say something that they think runs afoul of this faux charity, which is really just wimpiness.
Well, let's talk a bit about this tendency for certain types of Christians or supposed conservatives to just always throw, as you put it, the retrograde is always the one who gets thrown under the bus. It's never the radical. It's always the retrograde being sacrificed to please the radical. Is this the mod cons who are doing this? What does it reveal about somebody when they're so quick to do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a logic to basically there are 4 types of people, right? 2 types of moderate. Well, the one type really is just a cowardly leftist that doesn't want to own being a radical. And the other type is leaning strongly toward the right and is basically a cowardly conservative. But of course, the mean, the arithmetic mean, is much staggered toward the left because they're so good at what they do. They're so good at fighting that even the average inclines leftward. So yeah, I mean, because the average inclines leftward, all sorts of so-called ties, so-called draws, they all favor the left. So I don't care whether you're talking about winning over 10 people and you think, oh, well, 5 say I generally like right-wing stuff, 5 say I generally like left-wing stuff. What they're calling right-wing or left-wing will all incline leftwards. It's always the leftward version. Right. So this is just that arithmetic played out macroscopically. The idea that basically because they're such good fighters, they're so good at the cultural warfare, which they're just good at it. It's a virtue. They're wrong in every other instance. They're wrong in every matter of substance, but except they're really good at the procedure, how to have fights. And therefore, they're just much, much more winsome to nearby people. And what's not winsome is the moderate hemming and hawing. That the way conservatives look at liberals and they go, they always win. Why? It must be because they're always hemming and hawing. I don't know where they got that misinformation because that's not what they do. They say it really clearly. I mean, they're clearly lying, right? Mothers destroying their young it's not just murder. It's the most unnatural form of murder known to man. It's much worse than a regular murder, a mother destroying her young. They say it's reproductive rights, but they don't hem and haw. Hemming and hawing is the way to lose.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I wonder if you guys, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I wonder if you guys, because the conditioning that we live under is so strong, if you guys still have things, and let's maybe take abortion as an example since we've been talking about that, things where you even now still observe the effect of conditioning on your thinking or on what truths shock you to say or to admit to yourself. I can give an example for me if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with somebody maybe a year ago, and I've never in my life bought into the idea of, we should make abortion safe or that it needs to be safe or anything like that. I just never gave it any time in my mind. This guy said, it shouldn't be safe. Murder shouldn't be safe. It should be bloody and terrifying and painful, and you should be in danger of dying when you're committing a murder. And I was just like,
right.
I immediately saw that it was true, but I was also like very shocked and braced by that. I was like, I find that shocking to contemplate, even though I immediately recognize it as true, and I never consciously thought anything to the contrary.
Yeah. Yeah. You're talking about like the back alley abortion. Yeah. See, that wouldn't shock me. It's the worst form of murder. It's the most spiritually dangerous form of murder. So once subjecting oneself to a danger, everyone knows there's occupational hazard to being a burglar, right? You're going to get 9mm hemorrhage if you break into someone's house in Texas, right? So that wouldn't shock the conscience at all. Well, to be a mother who's a murderer of your own young, when people try to throw around the back alley abortion, well, it ought to be dangerous, right? No, that wouldn't shock me. That's a good example you gave, though. I'm too red-pilled on that issue, Thomas. But one that I've come around to recently is how much, apologies again for generational bias here, how much we were lied to by the boomers about family relations. This one gets me going, and I was, I guess, blue-pilled for a while, and I like to see the big angles, and the small angles. So I'm surprised at myself that I would be fooled for so long. Even just, we don't use the term broken families anymore. The kind of Mrs. Doubtfire rhetoric. We talked to your friend Layla Miller about this.
Yeah, I watched that.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, wow, my knee didn't jerk much when I had the instinct test or the reflex test. When I would watch a movie like Mrs. Doubtfire and they're selling families come in all shapes and sizes. Not so much from the LGBT angle, but rather from the divorced, destroyed household angle. Like, I didn't realize how important households were. And I think the baby boomers were really effective at selling us all on that snake oil, as they were very effective on selling all of us on the snake oil that mothers and fathers can kind of do each other's job and all of that. So family, the final assault of Satan on the world, according to Sister Lucy of Fatima. Family's really where they hit us. And I guess it's so close to home, no pun intended, that it's the hardest lie to detect.
Rule 30 is interesting. Be coarse, but never crass. Which of you wrote that one? And can you explain what that means?
Yeah, I wrote that one. Yeah. I had in mind my favorite genre of movies or subgenre. And even the students I've taught in the past make jokes that I'm like secretly in love with Christian Bale. I don't think it's that at all, because the guy's, he's not the character as he plays, but he plays incredibly tough. And movie critics will tell you, he always picks incredibly tough, high integrity, desperate men with their backs against the wall who refuse to become a consequentialist, even with their backs against the wall. And I feel like that's the most beautiful expression I've ever seen of manhood. So this is, I think, the portrait you're after. What's the title of Rule 30 exactly?
Do you have it let me look at this real quick. By the way, I wrote all the rules down in the table of contents, because the table of contents just gives the rule numbers. So I had to. I was like, dang it, guys! I have to write these down for reference in the table.
Yeah, it's arbitrary. We were laughing at in good fun, of course. We were laughing at our publisher rather than just say the page number on the rule. Why not say the title of the rule?
Okay, so Rule 30 is the retrograde must be tough-fibered but chaste. Accordingly, his watchword should be coarse but never crass. As will be understood below, he must have thick skin and a weak stomach.
Yeah, I mean, it's real simple. All my favorite movies are tough guys, about tough guys, where tough guys are at center stage doing what they must do, which is be tough, which is in season and out of season, always on order. Men have to be tough and be tough for principle, stand up for Jesus, stand up for their wives, stand up for their kids, and be willing to take it to the streets. But, be totally chaste. It's funny because if we talk about what temperance is, the virtue according to Aristotle and St. Thomas, it's the virtue where you have mastered vice in the realm of taste and touch. Right? And most people in 2020 think it's important to master the temptations of taste, right? Because they want to look good, because now everyone's on social media. But the thing that's motivating them to want to master the temptations against taste is that they want to give in, 20 times a day to temptations of touch. They want to look good so that they can, fornicate. So it's a special, everyone loves these movies. I show young men these movies that I teach, really, really incredibly violent movies, like the Christian Bale film Out of the Furnace, just about an uncompromising, unslimy, non-promiscuous guy that forgoes chances to fornicate, but will make his enemies pay. And I think that's what we I mean, there's real virtue in that, and men love that. Every man wants a battle to fight, and I forget the middle term there, a battle to fight and a war to win and a beautiful damsel to save. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is, to be really, really tough, even if it means just violence, but you have to be chaste.
So to a certain extent, it's not making an idol out of civility and politeness, which are genuinely good things, but to recognize the hierarchy of virtues there, right?
Yeah, civility falls low on our list, I think.
Yeah, but you have to recognize what's more fundamental. I think I didn't vote in the 2016 election, but I made the case afterwards when people were saying, this is the worst outcome possible. I prefer an ape over a serpent, so to speak. Someone who's coarse, someone who is not necessarily virtuous, but someone who doesn't have a conscious, I guess this is a slightly different topic, but somebody who doesn't have a conscious agenda to destroy Christianity. There is a difference between being a vicious person or a person lacking in certain important virtues and an actual Satanist, essentially.
Yeah, but I would say with elections, by voting for a candidate, you're not endorsing them as a human being, you're not endorsing their private
Absolutely,
life.
That's true.
Elections are consequential. And what Trump had identified as his major planks in the Republican platform that he was going to go after with his whole mind, heart, body, and soul, like immigration, ceasing the unstanched flow of immigration into the American borders. His heartfelt stance on abortion. Yeah, I'm going to prosecute. If Roe versus Wade is overturned, then mothers who go ahead and abort their kids in contravention of law against murder, they should be prosecuted. Right. And I'm in favor of that. These things that he spoke out on were really important. The borders, language, culture, those are really important issues. Those are going to drive the success or decline of America in the coming generations. And by him identifying those issues, by him showing his good judgment on those issues, he, by far, is a consequential matter, was the best candidate. So I didn't even have to hold my nose and vote for Trump. I eagerly voted for Trump. And it's, again, I don't have to agree with a candidate's religion. I don't have to agree with his personal views on what kind of just say in his personal moral life in general. What I do need is that I know that his priorities sync with mine and that he is going to be heartfelt in his attempt to procure those policy priorities for the country. So I don't need to agree with him on everything he does. Now, all other things equal, I will vote for the moral man in his private life over the man who is immoral in his private life, because there is something that is about one's character, one's morals, that, of course, integrally relates to how one governs. You know, if you have discipline as a private individual, then you're going to have discipline as a president. So there is that link, but it's on more of a minor order than a major order.
Well, I mean, that kind of ties into the rule as well, because if voting someone is not endorsing the person's entire personality or character, then people who are genuinely sort of repelled by Trump's character or personality should have a sense of moral perspective where they see it may bother them, but they should recognize the difference between having thin skin and a weak stomach. Where the principles counts and where the effects of your vote are going to count is what matters more than the fact that you find it distasteful to be associated by your vote in some way with this person because of their personal character.
Right. And Trump's fortitude, one of the greatest virtues that a leader can have is fortitude. Another one is vision. So there's a pecking order. There's a hierarchy of virtues that changes depending on what role you're taking, right? So the hierarchy of virtues in women, I've heard there's tradition with moralists going back several hundred years. There's chastity and modesty, and these are the crowning virtues.
Well, you can just look at what they're exhorted to by
crowning...
St. Paul, men versus women. What does St. Paul put an emphasis on?
Sure, right. There's a difference in virtues depending on your station and role in life. And yeah, this is a biblical thing. You have Paul with headship versus submission from men and women, respectively. And it's the same with leaders. If you're going to take on the role of a leader, then what the virtues you have to have are going to differ from those whom are being governed. So a leader is going to need fortitude and vision in a way that even just the person being governed is not going to need those things. Although they're still always going to present as virtues, it might be more appropriate for somebody being governed. They might flourish more if they have different virtues, maybe honesty and receptivity or something to that effect. I'm just speaking off the cuff. That's not like a scientific diagnosis or something. But certainly with leaders, fortitude and vision have a premium placed on them. And Trump showed those in spades in the campaign, even when he was challenged by a media that was trying to bring him down, that was trying to attack him, that was setting snares and traps for him. He clung to his central message, a message, mind you, that the rest of the cowards in the Republican Party would not say.
Rule 26 says the retrograde must use Saul Alinsky's shrewdest, trickiest rules for radicals against the radicals themselves. I'd like to ask for some clarification on this one, because obviously the book is meant to be in some ways a counter to Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals. And you point out in the introduction that in one way or another, however you take the epigram or whatever you want to call it to the book, he did take inspiration from Satan for his strategy to some extent. So in what sense can some of those rules be used or turned around, and what would you have to watch out? How do we discern on a strategic level what is acceptable among those for a Christian to use?
Well, on a strategic level, think about making these appeals in the public forum, like swordplay, like sword fighting. The substance lies in the breast of the man, the character. You have Edmond Dantes. He's a good guy. Sword fighting Fernand the Count Mondego. I mean, who's the better swordsman? It's just one set of rules, right? We need to stop looking at why are liberals so good at strategy in terms of how to win over people with clearly wrong positions? They're just good at being winsome. So look at it like swordplay. You wouldn't, if Dantes, the good man, wanted to beat Mondego, the wicked man, in a sword fight, you wouldn't say, well, you don't want to get that good at sword fighting. No, liberals are just better, on the average, much better at the sword play than radicals are than conservatives. That's what being a retrograde is. It just says, look, I'm going to keep 100% of the Christian principles which animate my desire to win this sword fight, but I want to learn what I need to learn about sword fighting to win.
Can you give an example of a strategy of Alinsky's that a Christian can and should use, and one that a Christian shouldn't use?
Well, it might be unsatisfying, but pretty much every rule you've asked us about here tonight, Thomas, is a kind of reversal of Alinskyism. I mean, it's not even really a reversal. It is Alinskyism. I mean, to always be on offense. Again, it's dumb that we have to say this is like a secret inside rule. You need the ball to score. That's not Alinsky. It's great. It's greater than Alinsky. It's just the nature of contest or of sports. I mean, which other ones have we brought up? Laughing at your opponent. When the sport is forensics, the proverbial ball is appeals. And when someone makes a ridiculous claim, like abortion is reproductive rights or men don't all have the same reproductive organs, there's only one sane response: laughter. But I mean, even that is kind of Alinsky. Everything we're talking about, every rule you've cited to us, is a reversal of Saul Alinskyism.
Well, there's a couple counterexamples, I would say. For one, fundamental to Alinsky's method was to pit the haves versus the have-nots, basically inciting people through envy. And what we say, one of our rules is, or one of the acknowledgments that we make in executing our rules, is that in keeping with Christian moral theology, ends never justify means. So I actually specifically spell out that the Christian can never have recourse to divisive group politics, i.e., stirring up envy within differing socioeconomic groups or within racial groups and between the sexes. We stipulate that this cannot licitly be done. And in a certain way, the retrogrades' hands are bound in a way that the radicals' hands are not bound. So there is that. And I think the other thing with Alinsky, when he dedicates his book to the devil, he's really doing it in such a way that he's dedicating the substance of what he's trying to deliver upon to the devil. He's dedicating his vision for the world, the vision for the governance of mankind. That is stemming from the devil. His methods aren't altogether, they're not intrinsically evil methods. For example, one of his big things, which actually kind of inspires our final rule, victory loves preparation, one of his big things is just community organizing. He was one of the first, the primary community organizers, which really just means, you sit down with people, you listen to what their grievances are, you take stock of how they want to change those grievances, and then you give them the ammunition that they need to implement their vision, to change what they see these grievances are and make a more palatable, more just society. Now, Alinsky is going to see a just society in a disordered way, one that's not harmonious with truth. But that's not intrinsically evil to have people say what they see as an injustice and then give them the means by which they can alter or abolish those injustices. That's a good thing, and that's something that retrogrades should be doing. So a lot of Alinsky, I think his dedication of the book to Satan was substantive, but his rules are primarily just matters of procedure and how to deliver on the substance of this very progressive society that he liked, this almost Marxist society that Alinsky would have liked to usher in. That's one thing.
Yeah, that kind of gets at what I was wondering about. Is there a reason you guys didn't have a rule or a discussion of the importance of prayer in winning these battles?
I would say, yeah, I think there is a reason for that. Because everybody knows, every good Christian knows that there's a duty to pray. They know that it's a grave duty to give God what he is worthy of, his just deserts, right? What his worthship, which is the heart of the word worship. So everybody knows this is incumbent upon us to give God praise and glory. And everybody knows, every Christian knows, it's a presupposition that we have to be praying constantly, as Paul exhorts us, right? So rather than taking up precious space, telling people what they already know, which is preaching to the choir, we wanted to tell people and emphasize the thing that tends to go unnoticed. It tends to be not picked up on by the pious and good men of the Christian West, is that we are soul and body. We're not just soul. We can't just pray about everything while letting the world go to pot. We're not allowed to just stay in our room all day. And if you can consult your catechism on this, you're not allowed to just stay in your room all day as a shut-in and not contribute to the tangible physical good of society and throw up your hands in exasperation. You need to pray, but you also need to be doing your duty as a citizen, or the duties of your vocation, or whatever those are, maybe as a priest or as a husband or as a wife. It's not enough just because we're not just a spiritual being, but rather we're a composite of body and soul, of form and matter. We have to be part of the world. We're in the world, but we're not of it. But we have a duty to make the world a more just and better place. And that requires legwork. That requires heavy lifting. And that requires tangible efforts and strategies that have to be implemented to achieve what justice is, to achieve the instantiation of justice on earth.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also a sometimes basketball coach. If I have a 30-second timeout, the reason we didn't talk about praying in this book is the same reason I don't have my players pray in a 30-second timeout, and no honest coach or a good coach would. It's not what's being underrepresented here. It's as simple as that. We have 40 rules. We're trying to say interesting, insightful things that are lacking. Not the one thing pretty much all Christian men are good for now. They pray about everything. You could always play this game. It's an infinite regression. Well, did you pray before you ate? Yeah, hopefully. Did you pray before you washed your hands before the meal? No. So why, you could always say, why not? Did you pray before you dried your hands after you washed your hands? No. I mean, this is kind of, you see my point. It becomes an infinite regression. I mean, pray.
And we dedicated to St. Michael.
Right.
We do dedicate the book to St. Michael, who's going to guide this endeavor in casting down Lucifer into the pits of hell.
So the emphasis is on combating a certain, well, as we said before, timidity, but also a certain kind of like quietism, or if that's the word, or it's kind of a sterility, because you have to pray as the foundation for everything, but you also have to be willing to put yourself out there so that your prayers will actually mean something, essentially.
Right. The Christian man, the retrograde is a Christian man. He's a theological and political conservatism. So we're presuming, because it's a duty incumbent on every Christian man to pray and to walk with God, to have a contemplative life, to have a spiritual life. We are assuming that this happens. And actually, it's like something we say in our rules about how to reconquer the culture. It's not enough just to bloviate to your nieces and nephews at Thanksgiving dinner about politics. It's not enough to just go vote. We're assuming you guys are doing that. If you want to win the culture back, you got to take up your mantle and fight. We've got to take the fight to the enemy, which is going to mean organizing, getting involved with special interest groups, donating our blood and sacred treasure to make the special interest groups work, and committing our time to these things. It's not enough to just show up at the polls and watch Fox News or EWTN. That's not going to win the culture for us. And the reason that we've lost the culture is precisely because people had that low of a bar for what it means to be a conservative or a retrograde before. It's the same with praying. If you're not praying, you're not a retrograde at all. You've got to be praying constantly, as Paul exhorts. So we're assuming that that's happening.
Right. In the same way that you have a number of rules combating a sort of false humility or timidity among conservatives, you also have a number of rules that address various tricks that we get caught up in. So we mentioned, don't get caught up arguing about exceptions to rules. Rule 31, don't let them personalize the general. I think you touched on that without naming the rule earlier. There's another one about you don't have to be part of a group to address issues relating to that group. So I don't have to be a woman to address issues of abortion or feminism, for example.
Right.
The one I'd like to ask you about is number 28. For radicals, the issue is never the real issue. And I mentioned maternity leave earlier on. There's a real naivete where people need to smart up, even on a lot of issues. Well, let's put it this way. I've often observed that a lot of Catholics want to be orthodox, where it will, in terms of, I don't want to be a heretic, but after making sure I'm not a heretic, they prefer to go with the world on whatever sort of prudential or seemingly innocuous issue they can to go along and get along. You know, maternity leave would probably be an example of that. So can you talk about how this idea that with radicals, there's always an issue behind these issues that they're pushing that may seem innocuous or charitable to the naive?
Right, like pretextual issues. Maternity leave is a pretextual issue for normalizing women working, for normalizing working mothers, for ripping women out of the home. Betty Friedan called the home the comfortable concentration camp. And she said it deprives women of a fundamental identity. And she uses the word anomie when she describes this lack of identity. And of course, we've seen since women have been, quote, liberated from the home, the paradox of declining women's happiness, wherein each generation, each 10 years, in the last 35 years, women have gotten less and less happy as a group, so that where they used to be happier than men as a group, they're now more unhappy than men as a group. And it's since their liberation, it's since they've been ripped away from the home, which is their rightful place, which was given to them by God. So that's the reason, though, why maternity leave is a thing. It's to normalize women in the workplace and because they have this built-in biological handicap where nature is telling them that their place is in the home by virtue of the fact that they get pregnant and they can't work and they have to be off their feet, not just for like 9 months during the pregnancy or whatever it is, the latter half of the pregnancy, but also they have to nurse and take care of a newborn baby once it's delivered. So they have to get around these biological imperatives of being a woman, and that creates problems because that means that women, if they're in the workforce, are going to be pregnant and they're going to have certain things that just their nature as a human being, as a woman, as a carrier of a baby and the nurturer of a baby are dictating to them. So in order to get women out of the home and to take down the traditional family, the patriarchal family, and feminists are quite honest about this as well, that in order to take down the patriarchal family, they need to rob the father of his wife. They need to take her out of the home, because as long as that traditional family exists with the mother at home and the father making the money and having the economic and temporal power, then woman will not be liberated. In order to do that, they need women in the workplace. And in order to get women in the workplace, they need to have it be feasible for women to be in the workplace and not be fired in the wake of having a baby when they're going to be basically invalids for a company for the next year or so. I think that's what is at the heart of that.
Is there any of your rules that I didn't mention that you would like to highlight briefly before we close? There doesn't have to be. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, it feels bad to say no, because we arranged these. Let me just say this in place of saying a particular rule. It's hard for me to even remember which one is which numerically. And of course, Tan didn't publish the title of the rules. We did go through and very deliberately with our wives. We figured out, once we had all 40 written, we reordered them and we said, okay, we think this will be the most aggressive, most efficacious arrangement. So they are deliberately arranged. Dave and I have talked in the last couple months, and I think we agree there are a few that we would have put in a different place. But for the most part, the rules are meant to be read in order, like a concept album. Yeah, for any Pink Floyd fans out there or whatever, prog rock people. So yeah, they're meant to be read in order, and each rule has its place. And it's a Catholic guide to war. It's a Catholic Sun Tzu. That's what we're trying to do. And if people bear that in mind as they read it, it'll help them to realize, oh, okay, this is why they're not talking about praying. This is why they're not talking about fold your hands when you pray. This is why they're not talking about follow the precepts of the church. Because that stuff is obvious. It's the one thing that Christians of our age, men of our age, and conservatives of our age writ large, they do mind their P's and Q's with these non-underrepresented truths and axioms of modern life. We're trying to tend to the rules of the fight that are maybe really obvious to denizens of another age, but are not obvious to the citizens of our own age. And as Alfred North Whitehead said, you judge an age not by its suppositions, but by its presuppositions. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to perhaps restore some of the lost presuppositions of the common sense man of yesteryear.
Yeah, I would add, just for my part, there's always one that is kind of my pet issue, because I think it's the most important issue, and it's this at the center of our cultural fight, is just that to win the culture, we have to reject feminism. And I don't recall off the top of my head where we ordered that rule, but it's really central, because in order to win the cultural battle, in order to renew the church and the West, the Western world, we need to restore the family, as it is the training grounds for future generations. It's the first and vital cell of society. Yeah. And since feminism is in and of itself an attack on the family, it's an attack on the order that God put into the world. It's an attack on patriarchy, which is the system of governance that God put into the world. Then feminism is itself attack on the family. And since it is an attack on the family, if it destroys what is the fundamental school of future generations, where they learn laughter, love, and mirth, and all sorts of skills, and they're educated and they learn the faith, if the family is destroyed, then the world will be destroyed. So we have to fight feminism. There's no good form of it, not first wave, not second wave, not third wave. They're all united in this unholy trifecta that's meant to destroy the patriarchy and install in its place at least a feminized patriarchy, because there's no such thing as really a matriarchy, as women are designed to be receptive and passive. So by very virtue of acting and giving gifts, women are acting basically like men. So what they want is a feminized patriarchy. And that, of course, would backfire. It would undermine everything that God instilled into creation. When you go against the plan of the Creator, you invite disorder into the world. So that would destroy the family at its core. And if you destroy the family at its core, you are going to have a place where youth are not educated. They're ill-mannered. They're curmudgeonly and angry and resentful, because all kids, of course, as nature tells us, are designed. They have a right to two parents, a mother and a father. And even Pope Francis has been very staunch on that issue. You have a right to two parents. And so generations that come up with broken families or that are raised largely by the state, they're going to have a chip on their shoulder. They're going to be bad citizens. They're going to be bad sons. They're going to be bad daughters and just bad people. So bearing that in mind, I think the fight for the soul of the family is truly the fight for the soul of the church and for the soul of the world. And we need to win that fight. So we need to overcome feminism. We need to restore the rightful roles of the sexes. We need to restore the headship of the man and the domesticity of the woman. And if we don't, we lose.
Yeah, that's a great thing to emphasize. And, this podcast is not really a culture war type podcast overall, but that is kind of like the issue that I've intuitively seized on as my pet culture war issue for whatever reason. I think it's probably for the reasons that you say. Of course, I reject egalitarianism more generally. It's something I have an interest in taking down, but feminism is one of the most pernicious and ubiquitous forms of that. In some ways, it's probably the school in which we learn to be egalitarian in every other way, right? I suppose you could say liberalism more generally came first, but we have to oppose the church and the priesthood and things like that. So
sure, no, it's fascinating. And it's funny how honest even the first wave feminisms were about their hatred for patriarchy, about their rebellion against their God-given roles as women, about their place as followers instead of heads. And that's really been buried and whitewashed by the prevailing narrative, by the powers that be that are pushing this narrative that, oh, women just wanted a recognition of their fundamental dignity and all this baloney. The vote was meant to install the feminized patriarchy, to throw out the real patriarchy. It was just the vote is a means to an end of destroying the patriarchy. That's what it was.
All right, guys, I think we should probably wrap up. Thank you so much for coming on, Tim and Dave. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. We've enjoyed this, and keep up the good work there.
Do you have any sense of the date for the release of your feminism book?
That's the question of the hour. It's being edited right now, and it's a different publisher than Rules for Retrogrades, which is TAN. This is Sophia, which published my first book, Catholic Republic. And, they get stuff out pretty quick when they want to. So we'll see. We don't have a great sense of it. I think it'll be, if not the late part of the year, at least the later part of the year, probably later summer or after. And we'll keep you updated.
Right.
Man.
Well,
thanks.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Thanks for looking out for it.
So I'll link people at the show notes page for today to the book. Yeah, as you said, that's from TAN, Rules for Retrogrades. Guys, thank you again, and God bless. Have a good night.
Thanks a lot. Good talking to you. Good meeting you. God bless.
Peace.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that interview and got something out of it. I'm now going to make some comments on the topic of prayer, which I probably would have made in the course of the conversation, except that I'm not used to disagreeing with guests on my podcast, and my instincts as an interviewer are conciliatory. So my comments are not about, what Tim and David should or shouldn't have put in their book. But there was a premise stated that Christians, or I think, as they put it, Christian men, praying is something that they're already doing sufficiently. Even though I was, as I said, conciliatory about it in the interview, I actually strongly disagree with this premise. First of all, from my own experience, because I have been, a person on the internet arguing about Catholic topics and not being faithful to the prayers I should be saying, not being faithful to my daily rosary, not being faithful to daily mass, and cultivating serious devotion to the Eucharist. And I'm certain that there are a great many people out there who consider themselves culture warriors or, warriors for Christ or whatever, who aren't actually committed to a serious life of prayer. And furthermore, a life of prayer for the purpose of personal conversion, even more than sort of to get the changes you think should happen in the world or in the church. I've also been the person who says his prayers, but fails to say them sincerely or with a real intent to convert. I constantly need to be exhorted and reminded and admonished to keep saying them and to say them with sincerity and to cooperate with the graces that they bring. So there was a remark Tim made to the effect that the problem isn't the left. The problem is cowardly Christians and conservatives. Well, I would say that's a problem, but really the problem is me, because if I see the problem, with other people, then it's on me to pray for them more and to convert so that my prayers will be efficacious. If people were really praying with sincerity in the way, for example, that Jesus and Mary told us to do at Fatima, they either wouldn't be cowardly or they'd be quickly on their way to no longer being cowardly. I think both among the timid and very much among many of the brash people who are willing to stand up and fight and argue, there is actually a lack of a serious prayer life. Actually, I think we live very much in an activist age, and I think that this attitude very much affects Catholics as well. People will recognize that prayer is necessary, or at least pay lip service to it, and they'll do it to a certain degree. But often even there's a lack of recognition that that's really where the fight is in personal prayer and conversion. So, as a friend of mine said a long time ago, we're supposed to be prayer warriors, not warrior prayers. The contemplative life actually takes precedence over and is the foundation for the active life. So it's not at all about denigrating the necessity for action. It's important not only to pray, but to recognize that however good in themselves, our actions are spiritually fruitless without a foundation in prayer. And nor did Tim or David say anything to the contrary of that. So what I really do disagree with is just the premise that, everybody already gets this among conservative Christians. If I can't even take it for granted with myself and I have to be constantly checking myself and exhorting myself, then I certainly can't take it for granted that other people are doing so. Again, I'm talking about a serious life of prayer, not just going to Mass on Sundays and saying a few little prayers here and there throughout the week. Serious devotion to Our Lady in the way that she's requested and to the Eucharist. Thanks again to Tim and Dave for coming on the show. God bless you, and I'll see you next week.